The mist clinging to the triple canopy jungle of the Hoang Hoa district does not smell like rain. It smells of wet rot, cordite, and the metallic tang of ancient laterite soil waiting to be turned into a grave. It is January 21st, 1968, precisely 05:30 local time. The sun has not yet breached the Annamite Mountains, and the world is a grey, suffocating wash of fog that limits visibility to the length of a rifle barrel. On a jagged limestone ridge, designated Hill 881 South, a Marine Lance Corporal shifts his weight in a trench that is barely deep enough to hide his helmet. He is one of roughly 300 men from the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, isolated on this pimple of rock, 4 miles northwest of the main combat base at Sanh. He is 19 years old. His hands are cracked from digging, his utilities are stained red with clay, and he is listening to the silence. It is a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that screams. Below him, in the valleys that snake toward Laos, the jungle floor is moving. It is not the wind, it is the North Vietnamese army. 2 entire divisions, the 304th and the 325C, are maneuvering into siege positions. 20,000 hardened regulars, veterans of a decade of war, dragging Soviet-made 130mm field guns and 122mm rockets through mud so thick it sucks the boots off men's feet. They are the steel coil of General von Nguyen-Giap, the architect of the impossible, the man who broke the French Empire at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier. The math is grotesque. 300 Marines on the hill, 6,000 in the main base below, against 20,000 encircling shock troops, with another 20,000 in reserve just across the border. By every doctrine of warfare written since the siege of Troy, the Marines are already dead. They are surrounded, cut off from overland supply, and pinned against a border they cannot cross. The trap has snapped shut. In a command bunker deep within the limestone caves of North Vietnam, the mood is not one of tension, but of professional, disciplined exhilaration. A senior NVA political officer stands before a map pinned to the damp rock wall. He taps the circle marked Sanh. The Americans have learned nothing, he says, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. The air is thick with the smoke of harsh tobacco. They have placed themselves in a bowl, just as the French did. They believe their helicopters will save them. They believe their technology makes them invincible. He looks around the table at the weathered faces of his battalion commanders, men who have spent their lives fighting in the shadows. We will strangle them. We will dig our trenches until we can smell their fear. We will deny them the air, and when the monsoon comes and the planes cannot fly, we will overrun them. It will be the final nail in their political coffin. One of the commanders chuckles, a dry, sharp sound. They have left 300 men on the outer hills, he notes, glancing at the intelligence report. An outpost. They think these 300 can stop the tide. Let them think it, the political officer replies, turning back to the map. Those 300 are not a shield. They are a hostage. When we take that hill, the base is blind. When the base is blind, the Americans die. He draws a red line through Hill 881 South. It is a gesture of absolute certainty, a dismissal. To him, the Marines on that hill are already ghosts, waiting for the paperwork of their destruction to catch up with reality. But the political officer is making a fatal calculation. He is fighting the war he can see, the war of men, rifles, and geography. He does not know that he is about to step into a new kind of war. A war of invisible lines, spectral sensors, and a kill chain that operates at the speed of light. He believes he is fighting 300 Marines. He is actually fighting a machine the size of a continent, a system that will turn the jungle into a mathematical equation where the solution is always zero. If you want to understand how the future of warfare was written in blood on a forgotten hill in 1968, and how a ghostly algorithm broke the back of a 20,000-man army, you must first understand the arrogance of the visible. The siege of Sanh was not merely a battle, it was a collision between two centuries. On one side, the North Vietnamese army, the masters of 19th century siegecraft perfected with 20th century discipline. They were the ultimate light infantry, fluid, resilient, capable of moving mountains of supplies on the backs of bicycles and laborers. Their doctrine was patience and proximity. They called it grabbing the enemy by the belt buckle. If they could get close enough, within 50 meters, the Americans could not use their artillery or air power without killing their own men. On the other side was the American military machine, a leviathan of logistics and firepower, struggling to apply industrial might to a guerrilla war. But at Sanh, the Americans did something different. They stopped chasing the guerrilla. They sat down, dug in, and invited the entire North Vietnamese army to come to them. It looked like suicide. To the press corps in Saigon, to the politicians in Washington, and certainly to General Giap in Hanoi, it looked like the Americans had voluntarily walked into a slaughterhouse. The base at Sanh was a plateau in a valley surrounded by high ground. The NVA controlled the heights, they controlled the roads, they had the initiative. But the Marines on Hill 881 South were not there to fight a conventional holding action. They were the bait in a trap so sophisticated that the enemy wouldn't realize they were caught in it until the sky fell down. Captain William Dabney, commanding India Company on Hill 881 South, knew the score. He was a Mustang officer, a man who had come up through the ranks, pragmatic and devoid of illusions. He looked at his perimeter, a tight oval of trenches and bunkers carved into the red clay. And he looked at the jungle pressing in on all sides. He knew that if the NVA decided to mass a regiment and overrun him, they could do it. The sheer weight of numbers would eventually crush the 300 defenders. But Dabney had an ace in the hole, or rather, an ace in the sky. The NVA plan relied on stealth. They would move at night under the cover of the canopy and the pervasive fog. They would dig approach trenches, zigzagging closer and closer, neutralizing the American firepower by staying invisible until the final assault. It had worked against the French. It had worked in 100 ambushes. But on the night of January 22nd, the NVA soldiers moving through the valley floor began to notice something wrong. A squad of NVA sappers, elite shock troops wrapped in camouflage, crept through the tall elephant grass toward the base of the hill. They moved with the silence of smoke. They made no sound. They showed no light. They were the best in the world at this craft. Suddenly, the earth erupted. There was no whine of incoming artillery, no distant thump of a mortar tube, just a sudden, cataclysmic disintegration of the world around them. A string of explosions walked through their formation with impossible precision. It wasn't a barrage. It was a sniper shot with 500-pound bombs. The survivors froze. They had not been detected. There were no flares overhead. The Marines on the hill were silent. How did the enemy know? They regrouped, moved 500 meters to the east, and tried again. 10 minutes later, the sky tore open again. This time, it was a flight of F-4 Phantoms, dropping napalm blindly through the clouds. But it wasn't blind. The canisters tumbled through the overcast and struck exactly where the NVA reserve platoon was assembling. Panic began to ripple through the NVA ranks. Not fear of death, they were prepared for that, but fear of the unnatural. They were being watched by eyes they couldn't see. They were being hunted by a ghost. This was the ghost effect, and it wasn't magic. It was the debut of the electronic battlefield. While the NVA commanders were studying maps of Dien Bien Phu, the Americans were deploying a technology that had never been used in warfare, the remote sensor network. The system was codenamed Operation Igloo White. It was the brainchild of scientists and technocrats who believed that war could be solved like an engineering problem. If you could measure the enemy, you could kill him. The jungle around Sanh had been seeded with thousands of sensors. They looked like innocuous spikes or small plants, dropped from aircraft in the months leading up to the siege. There was the ATSID, Air-Delivered Seismic Intrusion Detector. Shaped like a spear, it plummeted from the sky and buried itself in the ground, leaving only a tiny antenna disguised as a jungle weed above the surface. Inside, it contained a geophone so sensitive it could detect the footsteps of a man at 30 meters or the vibration of a truck axle at 300. There was the ACUSID, Acoustic and Seismic Intrusion Detector. It had a microphone that could listen to the jungle. It could transmit the sound of voices, the clank of metal on metal, the racking of a bolt. These sensors were battery-powered, rugged and silent. They lay dormant in the mud, waiting. When an NVA soldier stepped near one, it woke up. It didn't sound an alarm on the hill. It didn't alert the Marines in the trench. Instead, it sent a coded radio burst up into the stratosphere. High above the battlefield, orbiting in endless monotonous circles at 20,000 feet, was a modified EC-121 Constellation aircraft. It was a flying antenna farm, manned by technicians who never saw the ground. The aircraft caught the burst from the sensor and relayed it instantly to a massive, windowless concrete building hundreds of miles away in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand. This was the Infiltration Surveillance Center, ISC. If the trenches of Khe Sanh were the 19th century, the ISC was the 21st. It was the largest building in Southeast Asia, air-conditioned to a frigid temperature to protect the two IBM 36-65 mainframe computers humming in its heart. Inside, hundreds of analysts sat before glowing cathode ray tubes. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were data processors. They didn't wear flak jackets. They wore headsets. When the NVA squad moved through the elephant grass near Hill 881 South, they tripped a seismic sensor. A light blinked on a screen in Thailand. Activation on string 44, sensor Delta 9er, an analyst would murmur. Confirming, another would reply. Signature matches personnel movement. Cadence suggests heavy load. The IBM 360 processed the data. It didn't just report a blip. It analyzed the pattern. It compared the seismic waves to a library of known signatures. It ruled out buffalo, wind, and rain. It calculated the speed and direction of the targets. The computer then projected a box onto the map, a kill zone where the enemy would be in 5 minutes. This data was flashed to the targeting center. Coordinates were generated. Not rough estimates, but grid coordinates precise to within 50 meters. Back in the jungle, the NVA commander knew none of this. He only knew that every time he massed his troops for an attack, the sky exploded. He was fighting a war of movement against an enemy who had turned the jungle into a digital grid. The arrogance of the NVA command lay in their sabha, belief that the jungle was their ally. They believed the foliage hid them. They believed the night protected them. But to the IBM 360 in Thailand, the jungle was transparent. The night was irrelevant. The NVA were not soldiers moving through cover. They were data points moving across a screen. And the response to that data was the most terrifying weapon of the Cold War, the B-52 Stratofortress. The B-52 was not a tactical bomber. It was a strategic instrument of nuclear deterrence, designed to vaporize Soviet cities. But at Khe Sanh, it was used as close air support. This was a violation of every rule of air power. You do not use a strategic bomber to hit a target a few hundred meters from your own troops. The margin for error is non-existent, but the system made it possible. It was called Combat Skyspot, a ground-based radar guidance system that took control of the bomber's release mechanism. The pilots didn't look for the target. They didn't look through a bomb sight. They flew a precise vector at a precise speed, at a precise altitude, usually above 30,000 feet, well beyond the hearing range of the troops on the ground. The radar controller on the ground, miles away, watched the blip of the bomber merge with the coordinates generated by the sensor computer. When the math aligned, the controller pushed a button. 30,000 feet below, the NVA troops would hear nothing. The jungle would be quiet. The crickets would be chirping. Then the atmosphere would compress. A single B-52 carried 108 bombs. A cell of 3 B-52s dropped 324 bombs in a specific pattern, creating a box of destruction 1 kilometer long and half a kilometer wide. Within that box, nothing survived. The overpressure alone would liquefy internal organs. The shrapnel would shred trees into toothpicks. The sound was not a series of explosions, but a continuous rolling thunder that felt like the earth itself was cracking open. This was the Arclight strike. For the Marines on Hill 881 South, the Arclight was their god. They would watch the valley floor churn into dust. They would feel the shockwaves slam against their chests even from miles away. They saw secondary explosions ripple out as NVA ammunition dumps hidden deep in the jungle were detonated by the concussions. Captain Dabney and his 300 men were not holding the hill with rifles alone. They were the anchor point for a storm of steel. They were the bait that kept the NVA fixed in place so the system could work. But the NVA were not easily broken. They were disciplined, fanatical, and adaptable. They realized that if they stayed out in the open, they died. So they dug. They dug a complex network of tunnels and trenches, inching closer to the Marine wire. They tried to hug the American positions, moving so close that the B-52s couldn't bomb them without killing the Marines. This led to the crisis of February. The NVA 304th Division launched a coordinated assault on Hill 861A, a sister outpost to Dabney's 881 South. They breached the perimeter. It was hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. Marines fought with bayonets, entrenching tools and rocks. The Ghost system couldn't help them here. The computer couldn't distinguish between a Marine and an NVA soldier in the same foxhole. This was the moment the NVA had waited for. The technological advantage was nullified. It was flesh against flesh. But even here, the system adapted. The Marines on the hill had their own sensors, their eyes and ears. They called in artillery from the main base. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers at Sanh fired firecracker rounds, shells that burst in the air and rained thousands of steel darts. They fired variable time fuses that exploded just above the ground. The Marines on the hill hunkered down in their bunkers, calling fire on their own position. "Drop it on us!" they screamed into the radio. "We're in the holes. They're in the open." The artillery shredded the NVA assault force. The survivors retreated back into the jungle only to be picked up by the seismic sensors again. The moment they separated from the Marines, the B-52s returned. It was a cycle of despair for the attackers. If they attacked, they were met with a wall of lead. If they retreated, they were met with the wrath of the Arclight. If they stayed still, the sensors found them. The siege dragged on for 77 days. The world watched. The press reported that Sanh was a disaster waiting to happen. They compared it endlessly to Dien Bien Phu. They counted the days until the inevitable surrender. But they were looking at the wrong metrics. They were counting the number of shells falling on the base, which was immense, over 1,000 rounds a day at the peak. They were counting the casualties. They should have been looking at the logistics. The NVA plan relied on cutting the supply lines. They had severed Route 9, the only road to the base. They assumed the Americans would starve, but the Americans didn't need a road. They had the super gaggle. The weather over Sanh was atrocious. Fog, low clouds, monsoon rain. Planes couldn't see the runway. Helicopters were shot down by heavy machine gun fire from the surrounding hills. So the system innovated. The Marine Air Wing developed a tactic where A-4 Skyhawk jets would fly ahead of the transport helicopters. The jets would lay down a corridor of tear gas and smoke screens, blinding the NVA gunners. Then they would bomb the known anti-aircraft positions identified by the sensor network. Inside this tunnel of smoke and suppression, a flock of CH-46 helicopters would race in, drop pallets of ammunition and food, pick up the wounded, and race out. It was a ballet of violence and precision, executed in zero visibility, guided by radar. The NVA commanders watched in frustration. They had the base surrounded, they had the road cut. But the supplies kept coming. The Marines weren't starving. They were eating steak and eggs in their bunkers, while the NVA troops in the trenches were living on rice balls and fear. The turning point came in mid-March. The NVA, desperate to break the stalemate, planned an all-out assault to overrun the base. They massed their reserves. They brought up fresh regiments. The sensors heard them coming. The ISC in Thailand saw the seismic activity spike off the charts. The computers screamed. The analysts saw the pattern, a massive convergence of troops toward the southern perimeter. The American commander at Khe Sanh, Colonel David Lowndes, was alerted. But he didn't man the walls with every spare cook and clerk. He didn't panic. He waited. He knew exactly where they were. On the night of the planned assault, the NVA troops were in their assembly areas, checking their weapons, listening to the speeches of their political officers. They were ready to die for their country. Then the sky fell. The US Air Force launched a super arc-light. Dozens of B-52s flying in waves saturated the assembly areas. It was the most concentrated aerial bombardment in the history of warfare. The earth shook for 10 minutes straight. The sound was so loud it caused nosebleeds among the Marines inside the base. When the dust settled, there was no assault. The assembly areas had been erased. Entire battalions had ceased to exist. They hadn't even fired a shot. The NVA commanders were stunned. They had followed the doctrine. They had shown courage. They had endured hardships that would have broken any Western army. But they had been defeated by a force they couldn't grapple with. They were fighting a system that converted their movement into their own destruction. By April, the NVA began to melt away. They slipped back into the jungle, back toward Laos, leaving behind thousands of dead. The siege was broken. Not by a glorious cavalry charge, but by the relentless, grinding efficiency of the sensor bomber complex. The Marines on Hill 881 South climbed out of their trenches. They were gaunt, filthy, and exhausted. They had held their rock. They had looked 20,000 men in the eye and hadn't blinked. But as they looked out over the valley, they saw the true face of the victory. The jungle was gone. The lush canopy had been turned into a moonscape of craters. The trees were splintered stumps. The earth was churned and grey. It was a landscape manufactured by physics and data. The killer statistic of Khe Sanh is not the body count, though the estimates are staggering. Some sources claim up to 15,000 NVA dead, against fewer than 300 Marines killed in the hill fights and the base shelling, though total Allied casualties were higher. The true statistic is the tonnage. Over 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped around Khe Sanh during the siege. That is equivalent to 5 Hiroshima bombs, dropped not on a city, but on a patch of jungle the size of Manhattan. The ratio was absolute. For every Marine on that hill, the system delivered 300 tons of high explosive to the enemy. Let us return to that cave in North Vietnam. To the political officer and his map. The red line he drew through Hill 881 South is still there, but the hill remains. The hostage did not die. The trap did not snap. The officer stands in silence. The reports are on the table. They speak of regiments vaporized in the night, of supply columns destroyed by invisible birds, of a morale crisis among troops who feel they are fighting a sorcerer. He looks at the map, at the circle of Khe Sanh. He realizes now the magnitude of his error. He thought he was fighting the French in 1954. He thought he was fighting a colonial garrison whose will could be broken by isolation. He did not understand that the 300 men on that hill were not alone. They were the terminal end of a global circuit. a circuit that connected the mud of Vietnam to the silicon of Thailand and the stratospheric reach of the Strategic Air Command. He thought he was mocking the arrogance of the Americans. Instead, he had crashed against the cold, hard reality of the system's age. The lesson of Sanh was not about courage, though there was plenty of it. It was about the shift in the nature of war. The NVA brought heroism and history to the fight. The Americans brought an algorithm, and in the cold calculus of the 20th century, the algorithm won. The arrogance of the briefing room, the laughter at the 300, was silenced not by a retort, but by a radar signal. The ghost effect had proven that in modern war, if you can be seen by the sensor, you are already dead. The trigger is just a formality. The fog still clings to the Huong Hoa district today. The craters have softened, filled with green water and new growth. The metal of the sensors has rusted into the earth, indistinguishable from the iron-rich soil. But if you listen closely to the silence of the valley, you can still hear the echo of the lesson learned there. It is the sound of an army realizing that the world has changed, that the jungle no longer hides you, that the night no longer saves you, and that a handful of men, backed by the machinery of the sky, can hold the door against the tide. The ghost is still there, waiting in the data. To truly understand the visceral shock felt by the North Vietnamese commanders, we must descend from the strategic overview into the sweating, claustrophobic reality of the investigation. We must see the battlefield not from the sky, but from the lava mud through the eyes of the men tasked with breaking the unbreakable. Major Nguyen Van Hue of the 304th Division was a man of science before he was a man of war. Educated in Hanoi, he understood engineering. He understood cause and effect. When his regiment was ordered to isolate Hill 881 South, he approached the problem methodically. His first theory was conventional. The Americans were using forward observers with exceptional night vision devices. They must have starlight scopes, he told his subordinates, in a bunker dug deep into the roots of a banyan tree. They can see the heat of our bodies. To counter this, Hugh ordered his men to move only during the heavy rains, when the thermal contrast was low and the visual distortion was high. He ordered them to wear heavy canvas ponchos soaked in cold water to mask their heat signatures. It was a plausible theory, it was scientifically sound, and it was dead wrong. On the night of February 5th, a battalion of the 304th attempted to infiltrate the saddle between Hill 881 South and Hill 881 North. It was raining so hard that the water was ankle-deep on the trails. The wind was howling, masking any sound of movement. The men were cold, wet, and invisible to thermal optics. They moved in single file, gripping the belt of the man in front. They were confident. At 02, the lead company entered a narrow ravine. 3 minutes later, a flight of A6 intruders, guided by the radar Skyspot system, dropped 24 500-pound Mark 82 bombs into the ravine. The destruction was absolute. The ravine acted as a funnel for the blast wave. Major Hugh, watching from a ridge a kilometer away, saw the jungle light up with a strobe light intensity. He felt the ground punch his chest. When the smoke cleared, he found only silence. No wounded screaming, just the heavy patter of rain on churned earth. Hugh was shaken. His theory of visual or thermal detection was shattered. The Americans had bombed a target they could not possibly see in weather that grounded birds at a time when no human observer could function. He moved to his second theory: spies. There must be traitors among the local tribes, he reasoned. The Brew people are guiding them. He ordered a ruthless sweep of the local villages. He tightened operational security. No one was allowed to know the route of march until the hour of departure. Yet the bombs kept falling. Supply columns moving through secure areas were vaporized. Artillery positions that had fired only once were counter-batteried within minutes by airstrikes. It was as if the ground itself was betraying them. Hugh decided to conduct a technical autopsy of the battlefield. He risked his life to crawl into the craters to examine the debris of the American ordnance. He was looking for the answer. One afternoon, a scout brought him a strange object found near a trail junction. It looked like an oversized dart, painted a mottled green and brown. It was heavy, with a spiked nose and a strange, plastic-like plant structure at the tail. Hieu took the object apart. He found batteries. He found complex circuitry. He found a delicate instrument that looked like the needle of a seismograph. He realized with a cold dread what he was holding. "It is not a weapon," he whispered to his executive officer. "It is an ear." He looked at the jungle around him. It was vast, dense, infinite. And he realized that the Americans had bugged the entire forest. This was the scale shift. Hieu realized he wasn't fighting a tactical battle for a hill. He was fighting an industrial war against a sensor grid. The ghost was not a spirit. It was a network. The implications were terrifying. If the Americans could hear them, they could map them. If they could map them, they could predict them. Hughes tried to counter it. He ordered his men to walk softly. He ordered them to drive cattle down the trails to trigger the sensors. He tried to confuse the machine, but the machine was learning. The analysts in Thailand were beginning to recognize the difference between the seismic signature of a cow and a squad of men. The cow meandered. The men marched in rhythm. The cadence gave them away. The ghost was getting smarter. Meanwhile, on Hill 881 South, Captain Dabney was fighting his own battle against the impossible. His 300 Marines were living in a moonscape. The hill had been stripped of vegetation by the constant shelling. They were living in bunkers reinforced with sandbags, timber, and runway matting. The NVA shelled them relentlessly. Sniper fire was constant. If a Marine exposed his head for more than a second, he was dead. But Dabney noticed the change in the enemy. In the early days, the NVA attacks were bold, aggressive. Now they were tentative. The enemy was hesitant to mass. They knew that gathering in large numbers was a death sentence. Dabney realized that the ghost was imposing a psychological paralysis on the enemy. The NVA commanders were afraid to give orders. They were afraid to move. The initiative had shifted. The 300 Marines were no longer the besieged. They were the spotters for the executioner. Dabney used this. He ordered his men to conduct aggressive patrols, not to engage the enemy, but to stimulate them, to make them move, to make them react. Every time the NVA reacted, they lit up the sensor grid. And every time they lit up the grid, the B-52s arrived. It was a brutal, cynical strategy. The Marines were the lure. The NVA were the prey, and the B-52s were the trap. The scale of the industry supporting this trap was staggering. The airlift alone was a feat of logistical genius. The C-130 Hercules transports, the workhorses of the war, were too large to land on the damaged runway at Khe Sanh under fire. So they developed the LAPES system, low-altitude parachute extraction system. A C-130 would come in at treetop level, roaring over the runway at 130 knots. The rear ramp would open. A drogue parachute would deploy, pulling a massive pallet of supplies out the back. The pallet would skid along the runway, sparking and smoking, while the plane pulled up and away without ever touching the ground. It was madness. It was brilliant. It required pilots with ice water in their veins, and it meant that the Marines on the hill never ran out of ammunition. They never ran out of water. They had plasma, morphine, and grenades. The NVA, on the other hand, were starving. Their supply lines were being hammered by the same sensor-directed airstrikes that protected the hill. The ghost was strangling them. Major Hieu watched his battalion wither. Men were dying of malaria because the medicine convoys were bombed. They were eating half rations. Their morale was cracking. He wrote in his diary, "We are fighting a rich man's war. They spend $1 million to kill one of us. They drop bombs that cost more than my village earns in 100 years. How can we defeat a people who burn gold to clear the jungle?" This was the philosophical crux of the conflict. The NVA believed in the power of the human spirit. The Americans believed in the power of the gross national product. At Khe Sanh, the GNP was winning. The climax of the siege was not a single dramatic charge, but the realization of a mathematical inevitability. By late March, the NVA command in Hanoi had to face the reality. The Dien Bien Phu strategy had failed. They could not isolate the base. They could not overrun the outposts. They could not mass their troops. The two key variables had been revealed: total information dominance, which removed the fog of war for the Americans while thickening it for the NVA, and total kinetic delivery, which allowed the Americans to deliver unlimited destruction to any point on the grid, regardless of weather or visibility. When you combine these two variables, you get a zero-sum game. The enemy cannot move without being seen, and cannot be seen without being destroyed. The killer humbling moment came on March 30th. The NVA 66th Regiment attempted one final desperate assault on the eastern perimeter of the base. They abandoned stealth. They decided to overwhelm the sensors with sheer mass. If we all run at once, the logic went, they cannot kill us all. They charged out of the fog, screaming, firing AK-47s from the hip. It was a wave of humanity. The Marines in the trenches braced themselves. They gripped their M16s. They prepared for the end. But the end didn't come for them. The sensor grid had detected the vibration of thousands of boots minutes before the visual contact. The computers in Thailand had already flagged the anomaly. The flash priority signal had gone out to every aircraft in the sky. As the NVA wave crested the rise, a flight of A-1 Sky Raiders, slow, propeller-driven attack planes carrying massive loads of napalm and cluster bombs, dropped out of the clouds. They laid a wall of fire across the front of the NVA charge. It was a curtain of heat so intense it sucked the oxygen out of the air. The charge stopped. The wave broke. Then the artillery opened up. The box barrage, 6,000 shells in 1 hour. The NVA regiment didn't retreat. It evaporated. The survivors who crawled back to the jungle edge found Major Hugh waiting. He didn't yell. He didn't exhort them to courage. He simply looked at the smoking wasteland in front of them. "We cannot fight the sky," one of the soldiers said, weeping. "The sky is on fire." Hugh nodded. He understood now. The arrogance of the opening days, the laughter at the 300, seemed like a memory from a different life. The withdrawal began the next week. The NVA pulled back, leaving their dead where they fell. They dismantled their siege lines. They faded back into the sanctuary of Laos. The siege of Khe Sanh was over. The Marines on Hill 881 South stood up. They stretched their legs. They looked at each other, dirty, bearded, hollow-eyed. They were alive. They hadn't won because they were better shots, though they were. They hadn't won because they were braver, though they were. They had won because they were the human interface of a system that had rendered the 19th century concept of a siege obsolete. Let us return one last time to the command bunker in Hanoi. The map is still there. The red line through Hill 881 South is still there. But the mood has changed. The laughter is gone. The smoke is stale. The political officer takes the red marker. He does not cross out the hill. He circles the entire valley. "We must change," he says quietly. "We cannot fight them this way. We cannot fight their machines with our bodies." He is acknowledging the destruction of his own arrogance. He has learned the lesson that the 20th century taught every army that tried to fight the United States. You cannot win a contest of mass against a contest of precision. The ghost effect of Khe Sanh haunted the NVA for the rest of the war. They never again attempted a siege of that magnitude against a dug-in American force supported by air power. They shifted tactics. They went back to the shadows. They realized that to survive the algorithm, they had to become noise, not signal. The 300 Marines on the hill were eventually rotated out. They went home, or they went to other battles. but the hill remained. Today, if you hike up the slopes of Hill 881 South, the wind still howls through the elephant grass. The trenches are gone, filled in by 50 years of rain, but the ground is still lumpy with the rusted casings of 1 million shells. And if you dig a few inches down, you might find a strange spike-shaped object. A piece of metal with a corroded battery and a delicate wire. It is a fossil of the future. A remnant of the moment when war stopped being a duel of men and became a duel of systems. The NVA commanders were stunned not because they lost a battle. They were stunned because they looked into the face of the future and they saw that it had no face at all. Only a sensor, a computer, and a coordinate. They thought they were fighting 300 Marines. They were fighting the inevitable. And against the inevitable, there is no victory. There is only survival. The silence on the hill is the only truth that remains. The silence of the ghost that won. To fully appreciate the stunned reaction of the NVA, we must dissect the specific technological terror they faced. It wasn't just bombing, it was a synchronized orchestra of destruction. The sensor was the ADSID, Air-Delivered Seismic Intrusion Detector. It was a 3-foot-long spear, camouflaged to look like a jungle plant. Inside was a geophone capable of detecting the seismic wave of a footstep. It could differentiate between a man, rhythmic, light, and a vehicle, heavy, continuous. Dropped from F-4 Phantoms at high speed, the tail fins stabilized it, driving it into the earth like a javelin. Only the antenna, a flexible wire resembling a weed, remained above ground. The NVA would walk down a trail they knew was empty. No patrols, no mines. Yet, 5 minutes later, artillery would land on their heads. They began to believe the Americans had supernatural powers. They started conducting spirit-cleansing rituals on the trails, thinking they were cursed. They didn't know they were walking on microphones. The brain was the ISC, Infiltration Surveillance Center. Located in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, it was known as Naked Fanny by the troops. The atmosphere was sterile, cold, and fluorescent, a stark contrast to the humid, leech-infested jungle. The staff were Air Force technicians who worked 12-hour shifts monitoring strings of sensors. They developed a godlike complex. They could kill men they never saw with a phone call. The process was simple. A sensor activates, the computer triangulates, the analyst confirms. The target coordinates are passed to the ABCCC, Airborne Battlefield Command and Control Center. The loop took less than 5 minutes. The hammer was the B-52 Arclight. The payload was up to 60,000 pounds of ordnance per plane, flying in cells of 3. The NVA called it the Whispering Death because the bombs traveled faster than sound. You died before you heard the explosion. The bombs were often fused with daisy cutters, long extensions on the nose that detonated the bomb above the ground. This didn't dig a crater, it created a horizontal scythe of shrapnel that cleared the jungle floor without churning the earth. It was designed to kill personnel instantly. Imagine being an NVA soldier. You have marched for 3 months down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You are hungry. You are tired. You are told that the Americans are soft, that they are trapped. You dig a trench. You are safe. Then the ground liquefies. You are thrown against the wall of your bunker. Your ears bleed. The air is sucked out of your lungs. You crawl out. The jungle is gone. Your platoon is gone. There is no enemy in sight. No planes overhead. Just the grey sky. You try to move to a new position. You are quiet. You are careful. 10 minutes later, it happens again. You begin to realize that you are not fighting soldiers. You are fighting a god that can see through the earth. This is what broke the NVA at Khe Sanh. Not the 300 Marines on the hill, though they were the anvil. It was the hammer of the system that they could not see, touch, or understand. The Marines on Hill 881 South became the ultimate testament to the concept of force multiplier. A small unit, backed by a massive system, can hold off a division. This concept defines modern warfare today. From the drone operators in Nevada supporting special forces in Syria to the satellite-guided HIMARS in Ukraine, the DNA of Sanh is present. The NVA commanders were the first to feel the weight of this new reality. Their shock was the shock of the old world colliding with the new. They learned that courage is essential but insufficient. They learned that in the age of the censor there is no place to hide. And they learned that 300 men standing on a hill in the fog can cast a shadow that covers an entire army. The story of Sanh is often told as a story of grit. And it is. But it is also the story of the birth of the electronic ghost. The ghost that watches. The ghost that calculates. The ghost that kills. And on that hill in 1968, the ghost was a Marine.